Good evening, Mayor and Board, residents. So before we bring Matt Drabik up, our consultant for Fehr Graham, to kind of walk us through this presentation, I want to read something. The village has expended time and treasure to work with our partners, Izaak Walton, John Brinkman. I saw he's here, John from Izaak Walton. John, where are you? There he is back there. And Kevin Jennings. Is Kevin here? No. Kevin's not here. To hire a reputable consultant, Fehr Graham of Aurora, Illinois, to evaluate Prairie Lakes detention pond. We call it the detention bond, but we affectionately refer to it also as Prairie Lakes. The final study in its entirety is posted on the village's website. This nearly 400-page study is so voluminous that we try to avoid printing it to obviously save trees. I would like to thank Amy Crump, who fearlessly and diligently over the course of many board meetings explained the difference between misinformation and disinformation. I believe the book was on tyranny, correct?
It was on disinformation.
On disinformation, okay. Well, tyranny sounds that I could make matches.
I read that one too, but.
With misinformation being genuinely false or inaccurate information, and disinformation being false information that is intended to deliberately mislead with wrong intent and motive. I would like to honestly thank our mayor and board who heard the concerns and information that was propagated through print and online media and put their money where their mouths were to commission this over $90,000 study. I would like to thank our partners, Izaak Walton, specifically John Brinkman and Kevin Jennings, who were critical in interpreting and speaking the language of the consultant team. I would also like to thank Terrence Aqua, Assistant Village Manager, and our entire staff for their efforts in facilitating an open and honest evaluation of this pond. Tonight, I would like to introduce Matthew Drabik, Project Manager for Fehr Graham Engineering and Environmental Division. Matt will present the study on tonight, and he, along with key representatives from Izaak Walton and the village staff, are available to answer any questions. Matt, come on up.
Good evening. Napoleon said I'm Matt Drabik from Fehr Graham. I'm an environmental project manager. I'm here to talk about the Prairie Lakes environmental site investigation that we did, obviously in collaboration with Izaak Walton and the Village of Homewood. They were great partners throughout, and so we kind of worked, communicated, and the scope of this project, what we needed to investigate, and talked over the results. And they were partners all the way through, which was really helpful for us as well. Just a little bit about who we are at Fehr Graham. We've been doing this for more than 50 years, environmental and engineering work with municipal, federal clients, watershed groups throughout the Midwest, not just in Illinois. For me, myself, I've had experience with phase 1 and phase 2 site investigations, so environmental site investigations, soil investigations, water quality monitoring for the EPA, DNR, municipal clients, and then even wetland delineations and some biological research is my background. From my work experience, over 10 years work experience, and my education from the University of Illinois. But as for this specific project, what we did, there were 4 rounds of water quality sampling that we conducted and 2 rounds of sediment sampling throughout the Prairie Lake system, not just confined to the Homewood disposal outfall. And then there were expanded parameters, so we tested for pretty much everything under the sun that was reasonable, just to make sure that beyond a reasonable doubt, there was no stone left unturned, that this lake was clean and healthy for the public. And then we also did a bathymetric survey, which was testing for just seeing where the sediment was building up around the lake, as part of the function of the vegetated shelf. It was to stop kind of the urban runoff of the area before it gets to the lake. And so that was to kind of see where the sediment's building up and which parts of the main lake. Really quickly, just a map of where we sampled. There are sampling depths and the dates that we took them, but the important things are those yellow dots of where we sampled. So we sampled the settling basin on that southeast corner, mid-lake, and the outlet structure where all the water eventually leaves the Prairie Lake system. Those are our kind of 3 main lake sampling points. But then we also sampled that west filter area, which is the wetland biofilter area, which is supposed to filter out some of that urban runoff and sediment before it gets to the main lake. The northwest filter area, where the Homewood disposal outfall is, and some of that orange discoloration that kind of precipitated this whole investigation. We also had a focus on Homewood disposal. There's a manhole right next to the facility where there's some pump pulls groundwater and discharges. So we had a sampling location there. And then we had our last sampling location to the east in that east-northeast wetland biofilter area. So just for reference of kind of where we're going to be talking about. So what we found. So first off, the environmental investigation was triggered by this discoloration, sheen, this oily sheen, these odors that we were seeing kind of on this outfall in that northwest filter area, which is downstream from Homewood disposal, that was cause of concern. That discoloration, that sheen, the odor, we were seeing that during our investigation as well. So we made sure to test from the sheen itself, test from the water column, the precipitates, and the sediment that was nearby, so we made sure to capture that. We were also seeing orange discoloration and kind of a slimy residue, filamentous residue in the manhole upstream where Homewood disposals some pump discharges to, and I'll explain that in a second. And then high levels of iron in not just that outfall location, but each wetland filter area with some elevated concentrations of iron coming out of that sump pump discharge from Homewood disposal. So what we're talking about with the sheen, so this is a couple of pictures we took. I think this is from our June or July sampling event. And so you see kind of that oily sheen that's coming. The left picture kind of cuts it off, but it's not coming from any outfall source, it's coming from the ground itself. And that right picture is a really clear picture of the sheen that we're seeing. However, this sheen, these pictures are not taken at the Homewood disposal outfall. These are actually taken in the west filter area, which is about 200, 250 feet southwest of that location. And what this is supposed to show is that we were seeing this sheen, these odors, and this orange color in locations not just confined to downstream of Homewood disposal. That right picture, it's a little hard to see on here, but and we'll talk about it in the next slide, but what that's trying to show too is the result of a stick test, and it sounds very rudimentary, but it's used a lot in wetland delineation. So stick test is you basically probe a sheen like that with a pin or something sharp, and if it shatters like glass, like that does, and doesn't reform, that's a result of naturally occurring iron-reducing bacteria. So an oil slick will disperse evenly and then come back together. Naturally occurring iron-reducing bacteria, this is the product of those, will kind of shatter like glass like that and won't reform. So that's kind of one of the first things you look for. We use it all the time in wetland work, because wetlands are anaerobic conditions, which we'll talk about here. So what's going on? So again, naturally occurring iron-reducing bacteria, commonly found in soil, surface water, and shallow groundwater. And so what's happening is the ferrous iron that's underground in the groundwater has no oxygen. As it is brought up to the surface by a sump pump or running through a storm sewer system, it becomes oxidized. As it oxidizes and it interacts with these bacteria, they form this orange filamentous kind of slimy material. They form that oily looking sheen, and they form these odors, these kind of swampy odors and orange precipitates. So it occurs often in wetlands and groundwater, like I said, because those are anaerobic environments. And then once the water is brought to the surface, it gets oxidized, and we see these kind of products from iron-reducing bacteria. The important thing, though, about iron-reducing bacteria is they have not been shown to pose any human health risks. There's not any even drinking water standards related to them. Unlike other bacteria, E. coli, total coliforms that you test for in drinking water, these iron-reducing bacteria have not been shown to pose any human health risks. This is kind of a naturally occurring phenomenon. So the test for the bacteria, there's no test for the bacteria themselves. Usually visual inspection is considered adequate to know the bacteria are there, but we still tested from these kind of sheens themselves and the water column and sediment nearby. And we're not seeing those high concentrations of volatile organic chemicals or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So chemicals related to oils and petroleum products, we weren't seeing those in the sheens, in the sediment nearby, in the water column. And again, these bacteria, no human health concerns are noted, but aesthetically, obviously it can be displeasing. It forms that kind of orange slime, orange discoloration, red discoloration in the water. and can sometimes clog up stormwater infrastructure and screens. But as an overview of, obviously, because we weren't just looking at that one outfall location, we wanted a holistic view of how the health of the Prairie Lake system was. So we used the IEPA water quality standards for surface water and retention ponds. These are the applicable surface water standards that are for Prairie Lakes. We did include other metrics to compare to that were compared to in the previous Bryan study, but these are not applicable to Prairie Lake system. The important ones that we're going to be talking about are the IEPA surface water quality standards. These are the ones that Prairie Lake system has to abide by, and that surface water systems and lakes have to meet all these standards. And in general, health of the Prairie Lake system is good. We didn't find any evidence of the water being toxic, and the wetland biofilters appeared to be functioning as they should, especially as this was created to control urban runoff of sediment and other nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen that could run off from overground flow in storm events. And we were finding the nutrient levels and the water standard metrics were high quality in that mid-lake and outlet structured location. So all of that seems to be functioning as it should. Based on the last sampling that the Bryan Consulting did and the IEPA recommendations, we did test for that fluoranthene. We didn't detect it in any of the water quality samples at any of our sites. It was detected in trace amounts in sediment, but not above any standards that the IEPA has set forth, the most rigorous Tier 1 standards, soil standards. So that, and even in the Bryan study, it was the fluoranthene that was detected before was actually outside of the containment booms, not inside the containment booms where the outfall was. So that's kind of in keeping with what they found before. We also tested for the dissolved fractions of metals, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and iron, which were suggested in the IEPA memorandum. Arsenic, cadmium, lead, none of them above standards that we encountered. Iron, we did encounter in high concentration, elevated concentrations in several of the wetland areas, and there was a lot of iron coming out of the groundwater, especially at that Homewood disposal outfall that was above IEPA standards for surface water. And we also employed low-level mercury detection. We did find trace amounts at several locations not above any standards. There was one detection slightly elevated at the outfall structure during a rain event, which is the most confusing because it should be the most diluted there. But we all recommended steps of continued monitoring later on to address that. But as far as other contaminants, PCB, TPH, these are all things related to transformer fuels and oil products. We weren't getting detections of pretty much across the board all these contaminants. The ones that we did detect of these benzos, which are associated with oil products, were trace detections in a couple locations, but none above IEPA, the most stringent IEPA surface water standards. But we were seeing some effects of runoff nutrients and organics in the wetland areas, which shouldn't be surprising. Total suspended solids, so all that sediment, chlorides, nitrogen, phosphorus, which is pretty regular to see in these wetland areas, and that's part of the point, is that they help that filter and stabilize the water column before it gets to the main lake. So it's kind of functioning as intended. And that wetland biofilter that I keep talking about, the picture on the left is an example of kind of what you'll see around the lake. That's Phragmites and cattail. So typical wetland plants stabilizing the soil and kind of helping filter out some of those nutrients before they get to the main lake. And then the right picture is iron in the groundwater, so that kind of orangish tint you'll see when there's a lot of iron in the water. You'll see some of that discoloration. General sediment sampling findings. We did get some detections of volatile organic compounds that were also detected in the Bryan study, but we did detect them not just at the Homewood disposal outfall. It seems like there's some background concentrations across the northern sites. And to be fair, the IEPA has high background concentrations associated just with that they ascribe to all metropolitan areas, just because of the developed use of urban areas, metropolitan areas, and their history. They kind of anticipate that some of these levels will be higher. But we did, residential and industrial, there were ingestion standards. So if, the sediment was accidentally ingested, there was one standard exceeded in a winter event near the Homewood disposal outfall, and 2 exceeded on that east filter area, so 400 or 500 feet east of the Homewood disposal outfall. And again, it seems like some of these the detections were limited across that northern site, so it seems like background concentrations in these soils, but no metals detected above Tier 1 exposure specific route values. So those are the most stringent IEPA soil values. Really quick, this is the result of the bathymetric survey. I'm not going to go too much into this, but just to show what it's basically showing is there's about half a foot to a foot of sediment through most of the lake, so not a lot of buildup. Southeast corner, that southwest corner, and that northwest corner, there's sometimes between a foot and a half of sediment, but it seems like those, for a system like this, that's not much at all. In fact, we had trouble finding sediment to test. So it seems like the wetland filters are doing their job, the vegetated shelf is doing the job, and any runoff and sediment that's coming into those areas is kind of being kept back and held by the wetlands so that it's not filling the lake with sediment and turbidity. And then lastly, the next steps and targeted recommendations. So first and foremost is educational signage around that outfall. So those pictures I showed were obviously at the west filter area, so a couple hundred feet away from the Homewood disposal outfall. I think one of the reasons though that that wasn't immediately alarming or there wasn't a call to action at that location is it's very far off the pedestrian paths. It's not very visible. That Homewood disposal outfall, that discoloration we're seeing there is right off the pedestrian path. So a lot of people are seeing it. And then, if for a general public, it's understandable why it would be alarming. This is a very common occurrence for people to call in what they're seeing from iron-reducing bacteria and have health officials come out just to tell them what's going on. So to avoid, just keep clarity and avoid confusion, educational signage, especially in that northwest filter area. Some continued and focused monitoring, especially in the main lake and the outlet structure where the water's ultimately leaving the lake to join other rivers and waters of the U.S. Some continued and focused monitoring there for things that are either have to be reported in their MS4 permit or just to make sure that we have no continued problems with the water quality leaving the lake. Algae management is always an option. Obviously, there's always going to be some level of algae in retention ponds and lakes like this. But there are non-invasive treatments that you can do. Copper sulfate, which is just as toxic as dropping a penny in the water, basically. It's not much, but having qualified companies come do that to treat for algae would help with phosphorus and dissolved oxygen levels in the main lake, which weren't problematic, but again, it's aesthetically displeasing. Fishing awareness, we talked about this actually with our Izaak Walton partners, was having trouble finding specific fishing recommendations online for the Prairie Lake system. But for systems like this, retention ponds, Prairie Lakes, it's pretty common to have catch and release only for fishing here. Right. So that just as a precaution, so we figured that would be something that would probably be prudent to implement at the Prairie Lake system. And then lastly, there is always the option of pre-treatment of outfall discharge, specifically that Homewood disposal. There are things like actually aerating the ferrous iron early so that it precipitates out into those iron flakes, and then you can filter that out to kind of get rid of some of that orange color discoloration and slime before it gets to the main lake. And these are just a couple of options that we had been exploring and talking about with our partners. But again, yeah, my name is Matthew Drabik. My email's there, again, from Fehr Graham. Appreciated being able to work for the village. And it was really nice working with the village and Izaak Walton throughout this. They didn't set us loose and say, go find what you will. And then we told them after 12 months, here's what we found. You know, it was a collaborative effort throughout, which made our jobs easier the whole time because there was no surprises on anyone's end. We made sure to check all the boxes and investigate what we think needed to be investigated and agreed upon how we interpreted the results. So it was nice working with both the village and Izaak Walton Preserve, and thank you for your time.
Matt, thank you, very comprehensive report, and so appreciate it.
Yeah.
Comments or questions from anyone in the audience?
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you recommend that, I mean, so the 175th Street corridor is one that the village is looking to develop. So how moving forward what does your firm recommend for, is like filtering, like what you were kind of loosely recommending for Homewood disposal? Is that something that you would think would also be a good idea as that is economically developed, since as you said, those kind of developments tend to be...
For other sump pumps and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, this because we were finding that iron all over, you would probably, anytime a facility had a sump pump discharge that went directly to the lake, they would probably encounter the same result, the same thing where we'd see that orange discoloration, that filamentous residue.
I think
So-
everything on that street has to go into Izaak Walton because it's a W, what it,
It's not their parking.
oh, you can't go the other
But
way.
it's the runoff.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but-
filtering like everybody's sometimes.
So yeah, if it's a direct discharge, yeah, you would see this because again, we weren't seeing just the iron right only on that one spot.
Okay.
It was all the way as far as that east filter area, and even the west filter area. We were getting detections of iron all over. I will say about iron in general, why the EPA is a little more lax about any iron regulations is because ferrous iron, so that water without oxygen. Or iron naturally, you won't find it a lot in surface water because once iron hits the oxygen, it'll turn to rust and it'll kind of flake out and precipitate out of the water column. So as it moves through the water, it kind of, all that iron in the water will kind of naturally settle out into the sediment where it was coming from originally anyways when it's pulled from the groundwater. But yes, to avoid that discoloration and kind of that aesthetically displeasing, I mean, any sump pump system that would set up, we would probably recommend filtering that out, all those precipitates out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Matt, I had a question about your, I think it was number 4, on region fishing awareness,
Oh.
right?
Yes, yeah.
I read your report, I didn't read the whole thing, but I read most of your report over the week, this morning actually. And under fishing awareness, you talked about the threat that mercury poses in a fishing environment,
Right.
especially for catfish,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Because there's some consolidation of that mercury
In the lipid, in the fatty layers.
fatty layers of catfish, right?
Mhm.
Then I proceeded to read the village's summary, and it said there was catch and release only right now in Izaak Walton. And today I happened to be down there, and it says our daily limits per member are 2 catfish, 2 trout, 8 total bluegill, perch, crappie, and or sunfish. So earlier we talked about misinformation, disinformation, let alone the fact I'm a little confused. Are we saying tonight that no one at Izaak Walton will be taking home and eating, frying, cooking fish based on the mercury levels?
So for the mercury level specifically, so not only did we test during all 4 rounds of it, but only the one test, again, when it was the most diluted with the runoff from the storm event. And kind of what should be the most surprising, that's the one you'd typically see the mercury level lowest. That was one of the exceedances we saw at the outlet structure. So part of the continued and focused monitoring, we wanted to keep monitoring the situation at that outlet structure just to make sure that mercury level wasn't a continued problem, which is why it's one of the recommendations. But in the meantime, just while we're continuing to monitoring that, we said, just this system in general and how it's set up to be a retention pond and as a stormwater runoff facility, catch and release and not eating of the fish would probably be advisable in the meantime while continued monitoring occurs at that structure.
John can speak to what's happening there now. John.
Well, I just want to remind everybody that there's two sets of lakes at Izaak Walton. There's the fishing lakes, the sandpit lakes, the traditional lakes of the preserve, and the Prairie Lakes, which is a retention pond system that was put in about 25 years ago. We do need to fix our signage, for sure, but it's going to be catch and release only for the Prairie Lakes. Our fishing regulations remain intact for the sandpit lakes. We had the sandpit lakes water quality examined by a private company about 10 years ago, and that report is on our website. And I can give you the short story. The sandpit lakes water quality is very high in the top decile of water lakes like that because there's no agricultural runoff, amazingly. So there's two sets of lakes going on here. And I don't think everybody should be aware of that, but we will fix our signs to make it clear that in the Prairie Lakes, it's catch and release only.
And your action was prompted by his report, correct?
If you look at our rules carefully, they're just incomplete. There were no rules about Prairie Lakes that were ever put in place.
But I don't think you'd be changing those rules until there was mercury detected, is that correct?
That's not correct.
Okay.
It's not correct because there was no mercury detected in the sandpit lakes. We just have to make it clear with our signage and our rules what applies to which system.
Anyone else? Gary?
Yeah, the iron, is that like a regional issue, or is that associated to what's the source of it? Is it like metallic?
So yeah, the iron is, a lot of times it's naturally occurring in the soils, iron and chlorides as well, come from the soils a lot of the time. In fact, NPD, so any people who are discharging directly to flowing rivers and stuff like that in Illinois, just about 50% of them exceed that 1 milligram per liter iron. The average is about 3, sometimes it's up to 200. And the EPA a lot of times there's no enforcement action behind it because the extenuating circumstances are that it's just naturally occurring in a lot of these soils. The problem, specifically what we're seeing with that Homewood disposal, is that it's going straight from an anaerobic, and then once that gets oxidized, it's very visible, the products of it. But the iron is in the soil, and that's why once it precipitates out in the lake and goes back into the sediment, that's where it came from originally. And there's just some soils with higher iron content than others, and that's just kind of a background concentration thing.
Thank you. In the back?
Oh, me?
Yes, please. If you could
Back to
stand.
the iron. So
Okay, I
I've
didn't
heard
see that.
anecdotally, and I did observe once an issue, that I heard anecdotally that the historic land use along 175th Street where Homewood Disposal is, that was decades ago a municipal landfill. So I was wondering if you looked at any old land use maps to see whether or not there's like a bunch of buried municipal stuff that would be leaching into the groundwater, because I think we have sandy soils along there, and I'm a little surprised that there would be that much iron associated with this Oakville sand loam.
Yeah. So typically for some pump water, it can be as high as like 50 milligrams per liter, parts per million. It's kind of the same. We were getting mid-20s, I believe, at Homewood Disposal, and I think it was 3 to 4 by the time it was in the wetland filter areas. As far as testing for things that could have come from the previous landfill, that was the expanded gamut of testing that we tested for kind of everything. Like all chemicals, volatile organic chemicals, polycyclic aromatics that could have been leaching in, specifically for iron. By the time MS4 permit for the village, the municipal separate storm sewer permit, their testing location is actually past that outfall structure where they have to test and meet these regulations by the time it gets to the main.
We just want to clarify too, you mentioned that at some point in time historically, there may have been a municipal landfill in that area. We have no evidence of any municipal landfill ever being present in that area at all. That was a part of the Washington Park racetrack. That detention pond was actually created and dug out after the Washington Park racetrack burned to the ground. So as far as municipal landfill, I just want to be clear so that no one leaves and says, yeah, they didn't mention anything about the municipal landfill. There's no evidence of historic evidence of a municipal landfill. Just want to be clear. Now, there may be people in the audience that have lived here for longer than I have, so.
Non-municipal?
Yeah, question there? Yes.
Yeah, so I also want to talk about the iron, because when we say that it's not toxic, but your report says these iron concentrations make the water unsafe for human consumption and present potential acute toxicity risk for aquatic animals. So we know aquatic animals go in and out of this space, so it is toxic for them. And in your full report, which thanks for the village to release that today, you did have 6 recommendations as opposed to 5, and one of the recommendations was treating the iron in the pond. So that's not here, so I just wonder your thoughts on that and why that wasn't included here and what that would mean.
So the 6 recommendations, so part of treating the iron was the pre-treatment of the outfall discharge. That's tied into that. The 6 recommendations, the one I didn't talk about was, it was a non-recommendation of dredging. That was one of the recommendations we had. So I didn't include it because it's not technically a recommendation, but that pre-treatment of the outfall discharge, that was I was talking about, where there's a couple options. You can chlorinate the system, shock chlorination of the system, and then there's also aeration of the system so that it, like I said, that ferrous iron that's trapped, that's dissolved in the water, precipitates out, and then you can actually physically filter that out. So those are a couple options that you could employ with that Homewood disposal outfall. Sorry, I forgot who asked the question earlier, but again, if you saw other developments in the area also creating sump pumps though, you would probably need the same kind of pre-treatment discharge to avoid seeing that discoloration and that filamentous slime.
So just to summarize, so the iron is coming from the groundwater, and treating it at Homewood disposal would prevent the acute toxicity in the Northwest.
Correct, and that the acute toxicity levels that we're seeing for wildlife or for aquatic species that make it uninhabitable for fish, that they would start to see effects and not die necessarily, but they'd see fecundity, reproduction effects, and stunted growth as kind of effects. That doesn't extend to the main lake. That's kind of concentrated in those wetland filter areas before it gets to the main lake. That's another thing. We're not seeing any of these nutrient issues by the time it gets to the mid-lake or settling basin or outlet structure location, because that's kind of what these wetland biofilters are supposed to do, filter that out. So as that iron moves through the system, it really quickly precipitates out, and then we weren't seeing any issues further on. But yeah, around those wetland areas themselves, there would be issues for aquatic life and maybe reproduction or stunted growth and those kind of things because of the iron content.
So it's good it's not in the larger Prairie Lakes, but we can't put signage for the fish.
But
Question in the back?
Yeah, I'm going to maybe take close to my 3 minutes here. A lot of this comment is going to be directed more towards the board than to you, although I'm curious to hear some of your things on it. Talking about disinformation, I appreciate you saying, agreeing on how you're going to interpret these results, that gets a little bit to some disinformation. I just want to talk about that. A big purpose of this study, that's a big relief that I'm really happy to hear, is that these toxic levels don't extend into the larger Prairie Lake system. That was a big purpose of this. I'm really relieved to hear that. That's great. I feel like throughout this presentation in the summary, but not in the main report, that the health of the Prairie Lake system is conflated a lot with the health of that specific Northwest pond, which does have toxic levels of iron, toxic levels of fluorides, I believe your report says, and the PAHs as well in the sediments. And so we're seeing all of that, and the levels match that were tested in the sump pump itself, and then right at that outflow discharge. And this is what South Suburbs for Green Space in our group was saying from the beginning. We know the source is the groundwater under Homewood Disposal. It's not Homewood Disposal's fault, other than their sump pump is discharging directly into the pond, which wouldn't be up to code if it was any one of your homes or any other business. It shouldn't be discharging directly into the pond. We've been saying this for months and years now, and so I just want to point out that this report actually validates everything our group was saying is, hey, there's an issue with the sump pump discharge coming from Homewood Disposal and this outflow specifically. The testing results from Fehr Graham confirm that. And so there is a major toxicity problem in the Northwest Pond. And the number one thing we're asking is to deal with the discharge, have it discharge over the field next to it, do pre-treatment, do something to address that discharge coming from Homewood Disposal sump pump. That was our main ask of this group, and we were ridiculed by many of the board members up here for trying to get you to act months ago when we already had the dye test that your own village public works department conducted and testing from, I forget the other company. From Brian. They also confirmed these toxic chemicals right there at the outflow. So we already knew a lot of this already, that there's a problem in the Northwest Pond and the outflow that you could have been acting on this entire time. So the source of the pollution is the sump pump discharge, which we said. The direct discharge of the pond violates your municipal code regardless of the presence of pollution. There's toxic iron chlorides and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons right there. I just want to point out that, yes, we're not worried about the bacteria that feeds on the iron. The iron itself is toxic at high levels. And so it's the village's responsibility to force Homewood Disposal to correct their sump pump discharge, and the Fehr Graham report explicitly recommends pre-treating the water before discharging. This is exactly what we have been asking for from the beginning. The Fehr Graham report, full report recommends concrete steps to improve the health of the Northwest Pond. I just really hope the board will now finally take action to address this and remediate it, and not use this summary report, which is a little bit rosier than the full report, to not act. I'm really glad the health of the Prairie Lakes is sound, although we also, years ago, asked for signage for people not to be fishing and eating the fish out of the ponds, and that was ignored by both the Izaak Walton Board and the HW.
Your time is up.
Okay, so I just really hope that you guys can
Thank
take
you.
action now that you have this report.
Final question, anyone else? If not, board comments. Trustee Harris-Jones.
Matt, I would like to thank you so much for your great presentation. I think you've opened our eyes to a lot of things that are going on in Prairie Lakes. We appreciate all of your education. I think, for one, the educational science will be a good thing to do for that area, so that visitors, residents, people that have pets, wildlife, all of that will be educated on what's going on in our lake.
And I think I shared when we were in discussions, some because obviously other places have taken steps to put signage where this has been seen in other lakes and wetlands before. So there's obviously plenty of examples that the board and the village can use to going forward to create signage for around those areas.
Mr. Willis.
Yes, thank you for the summary. Thank you for answering our concerned residents' questions, and we appreciate getting some answers that a lot of people have been asking for.
Was there anything on what Mr. Sachs said that you want to respond to? It didn't seem, he threw a lot of chemical names out there.
So for one of the things he was saying too is when he's talking about some of the things being present in the groundwater and how he's like, it's not their fault necessarily that they put it in, that it's in the soil, but it's that the sump's pulling it out of the soil. And we did find, like we said, not just at that northwest filter area, but that east filter area, some of those PAH chemicals that he was talking about that were at an exceedance of, it was one time at that west filter area and twice at the east filter area, which is, I forget which street that's under, but it's 400 feet east of there, that were in exceedance of ingestion standards, class 1. Residential and industrial ingestion standards. How far that go, like where those chemicals go in the sediment and how far it expands through Homewood. I mean, sometimes I know from our work from the city of Aurora, when we do water main projects and sanitary sewer projects, when they're removing that soil, we have to test for all these same things to make sure if they either have to landfill it or they can reuse the soil elsewhere. And it's common to see some of these VOCs and PAHs, the chemicals that he was discussing, in soils in urban areas, just because, back before the 70s, based on when development happened, reporting limits and regulations weren't as strict. So the IPA recognizes that sometimes these chemicals are in background soils, and them potentially being introduced into the water, from soils.
Thank you for clarifying. I hope the group feels some vindication, although I hope some of the vitriol stops even today. Some of the nastiness that's coming out is really uncalled for. And I'm glad we're moving forward, and I hope that we continue to make sure that we follow the recommended steps and keep going. It's always going to be an issue.
Trustee Simpson.
Matt, thank you very much. Very educational, very comprehensive. I think we need to listen to our recommendations, professional organization, we have experts here, and I think the village has been very transparent, accountable, and responsible in this investigation. And I echo Trustee Hefferman's comments about following the recommendations to continue to make sure that that area is safe. Thank you.
Trustee Mason.
Well, I echo what my colleagues have said. I appreciate the effort that went into this and really appreciate the way you laid it out and explained it to us. Really, really relatable, really very easy to understand. And I just look forward to us, working together to make sure recommendations are followed, signage is out, and we just want to make sure we are protecting the safety and security of all of our residents and pets and the ecosystems. Thank you.
Trustee Roman.
I guess I have a few questions about, so I think one thing that has continuously gotten lost in this conversation is the purpose of this stormwater detention pond. The purpose of this stormwater detention pond was never for people to fish. It was also not for people to wash their hands in case anybody is confused about that. But, so other communities that have had stormwater detention ponds that have had a similar situation, like how, is it addressed up front that there's signage that there should not be fishing in a stormwater detention pond? Or swimming or any of those things? Or like where, or should the sub pump not have been, like where did it go wrong is basically what I'm trying to get at.
So I guess there's a lot of different things in that. So as far as the no swimming and no fishing, that's very common for detention facilities to have that kind of signage and those kind of regulations. As far as the testing that was involved here, that's not typically required. We tested for everything we tested for because we wanted to make sure that there was to address the contamination, the concerns of contamination that were coming in through the lake. And that's why it wasn't just around that outfall, it was all through the Prairie Lake system. That testing is not typically required by any other retention ponds are not doing that. But it all precipitated from that discoloration and that sheen and stuff like that we were seeing. And again, that's a combination of several different things, background soil, iron concentrations in the background soils, and the fact that, yes, the sump pump discharging into that filter area, because it goes from that anaerobic to the aerobic state in that short amount of time, that we are seeing that. And so in other retention ponds, if they're not pulling up groundwater like that, then they're not going to see those issues. Or if there's no wetlands associated, so hydric soils associated with wetlands, like I said, we see that quite often too, because the soils become inundated with water. The water sits in that soil underneath the surface, and the iron seeps into the water, is not oxidized until it reaches the surface. So other detention ponds that don't have those wetlands, don't have those sumps dumping into them, and don't have the background concentrations of iron in their soil, they wouldn't see that orange filamentous discoloration or these oily sheens and stuff like that. So some of those are just a result of the area and the situation going on with the disposal.
Okay, so my next question was going to be if you've ever experienced this with another municipality where it was specifically a stormwater detention pond and how it was handled. But you said that typically they don't test stormwater detention.
Yeah, we're not, all the VOC, PCB, all of these contaminants we're testing for, like, a municipality is not going out typically and doing all these tests because they don't have, it's not required monitoring through the EPA. And I think even this testing we did, wasn't strictly set forth by the EPA or anything. We just wanted to make sure that the water quality was, checked all the boxes and that we were checking for everything possible pollutant. So it's kind of an atypical situation because yes, in other retention ponds, there are eventually when it reaches waters of the US, so flowing rivers, creeks and stuff like that, there are water quality metrics that you have to meet, but it's much more limited than what we were testing. It's things like pH and nutrients and dissolved oxygen, total fecal coliforms, that kind of stuff. But we tested for way more than that, and that's not something that you would typically see tested in any other municipality. Unless you had a reasonable concern, which is how this kind of all unfolded.
Okay, so do you feel like this was kind of above and beyond? The village kind of went
For the
above and beyond?
For the testing, yeah. I mean, this testing does not occur on every retention pond across the U.S. Most retention ponds are not permitted with MS4 permits or NPDES permits or anything like that, where they're regularly required to monitor these nutrients and hit these metrics. Partially because the point of retention ponds is to have some of these nutrients settle out and flow naturally through the system before they get to main bodies of water. But unless you had, unless there was a reasonable suspicion that someone was dumping and there was contamination directly linked into a retention pond, you would not test for these chemicals at other municipal retention ponds now.
Okay, and then just to clarify something that was said by someone in the audience, I just would like to hear like a yes or no from you. Do you believe that there is a major toxicity problem in the North Pond?
No.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, as someone who's out there with my dogs every morning, I have never seen anyone drinking the water. I've never seen anyone swimming in the water.
We didn't clear it for potable drinking.
All of the fishermen there in the large lakes, as John has said, it's catch and release. I've never seen anyone take any fish out of that.
Yeah.
I appreciate your study. I appreciate the comments of the folks in the audience. And what I think is most important is in your summary, where you specifically say that Prairie Lakes is not toxic, its functioning is designed, and does not pose a public health hazard. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.